It is 6 o'clock. Welcome, everybody. Before I get started, can we do a quick sound check for those joining online to see if they have any audio issues? Good online, James? They can hear me?
Put in chat, can you hear?
Tess? Thanks. Well, good evening again. My name is Quan Nguyen, and I work at the U.S. Army Environmental Command in San Antonio, Texas. And I appreciate everybody being here this evening, considering the weather conditions. We appreciate the community's interest and support of the former Badger Army Ammunition Plant cleanup projects and the dedication of the RAB members. I just want to ensure that everyone understands what's happening tonight, that the first thing that we're going to have is the RAB meeting itself. And during the RAB meeting, we will be presenting the Army's proposed plan of the site-wide groundwater remediation at the former Badger Army Ammunition Plant. So we will have a very limited agenda for tonight's RAB meeting. What we will be presenting to you will pretty much be the same information that you might have heard from the meeting back in 2019 for the remedial investigation and feasibility studies that was presented by Mr. Mike Kelly of the Pentagon. And that meeting is available on YouTube if anyone is interested in watching that recording. So we will answer your question tonight as best as we can. After the RAB meeting is over, we will begin with accepting oral comments for the proposed plan for the site-wide groundwater remediation. If you plan on making an oral comment tonight, and if you have not indicated that when you sign in, please do before the end of the RAB meeting. We will be calling out the names of those planning to make an oral comment by the order that they arrive, the best that we can. And once that is complete, we will move on to the folks joining virtually and to check to see if anybody online has any oral comments. If there's a large amount of people that prefer to make an oral comment instead of a written comment, we may have to limit the oral comment to 2 minutes per person. We would not be responding to any of the oral comments tonight. We are in a listening only mode. If you do not want to wait to make an oral comment, you're more than welcome to submit a written comment and leave it with us for consideration. Or you can also email us. The instructions on how to submit a written comment was provided in the invitation that has been that was publicly posted and emailed to the RAB members. There's no reason to submit both a written comment and an oral comment. When we prepared the record of decision, the Army would document all of the comments, both orally and written, and reply to those comments in that same document. And as a reminder, the public comment period started in December 16th, 2024, and it will end in February 28th of 2025, which is more than the standard 30 days that a public comment usually take place. So if anyone wants to provide a written comment, please email us or fill out one of the forms that is provided tonight and before the comment period is over. At this time, we will begin with the RAB meeting. I will pause right now, and if Kathy, you have any other announcements you would like to clarify or share?
So I'm going to try to facilitate to make sure we get through everything. We have a lot of information to convey to you in a limited amount of time. So we're going to ask that you hold your comments until Joel takes a break for not your comments, your questions, I'm sorry. Hold your questions until Joel takes a break. And if you need to write them down, please write them down. We don't want you to forget your questions and if you don't want to ask the question here, you can feel free to email it. The RAB meeting is the time for questions, not comments. The proposed plan public meeting that happens after the RAB meeting, that's the time for comments and not questions. If you're online, if you would put in the chat if you plan on giving an oral comment, that will help us ensure we're going through in the right order. If you haven't signed in, please sign in. We want to have a good attendance count. There's forms back there. If you want to leave a written comment while you're here, you can. And then the instructions that Juan mentioned, there are also copies back there that you can take with you. If you haven't yet met our new people, James is the contractor who is now helping us support the RAB meetings, and Scott is our new environmental support manager from Army Environmental Command.
Oh, great. Thanks, Kathy. So I'm going to reintroduce Scott again. He's with the U.S. Army Environmental Command, and he would be serving as the new environmental support manager and co-chair for the RAB for the Badger projects. He's replacing Ms. Laura Powell, who most of you have met from the previous RAB meeting. And of course, as always, I will continue to be part of the Badger cleanup project, so you can always reach out to me if you have any questions. So the Army emailed the meeting minutes for the October 2024 meeting, incorporating some of the RAB members' comments, and it was emailed to. It was emailed on December 5th of 2024. At this time, if there's no additional questions on that meeting minutes, we can move forward to finalize that October 2024 RAB meeting. All right. Thank you. So the future meetings is shown, I guess not yet, but on the screen right here. So these are the future dates of the next RAB meeting. As you can see, we include some RAB membership business that we plan to conduct in the April RAB meeting. I also want to mention that we emailed. Most of you guys received an email from Cherokee Nation on January 2nd. The forms that would attach to that email are for the RAB members to fill out so that the Army can periodically validate all of the RAB representatives. There's no deadline to fill those out, but if you can, we will appreciate it if you can complete that and return to us at your earliest convenience. And lastly, the Army understands that the RAB members is requesting a TAP support with the Gruber Grove Bay feasibility studies report that the Army is currently preparing. We will initiate that process with our leadership to request a waiver to provide that assistance. And we will work with the RAB co-chair, Ms. Michelle Hopp, to assist with the preparation of that application. And at this time, if there's no further questions, I would turn it over to the co-chair, Michelle Hopp, if she have any announcements to make. Thank you.
I want to just welcome everybody, all the RAB members in the audience. And I encourage you all to ask questions, because that's how you learn. have a couple of announcements. One is one of our at-large members, Mary Carol Solon, has passed away, and she passed away last month. And the other thing, I've had some interest expressed in having just an informal meeting of RAB members so we could go over the plans and help each other formulate our written comments. I'll send an email out, and if there's interest, I'll set something up. But I think because it's so complex, we might need to help each other a little bit. So if you have that interest, just let me know. And that's all I've got.
Thanks, Michelle. At this time, I will turn the presentation of the proposed plan for the site-wide groundwater remediation over to Joe Jensen.
Good evening. Good evening. Joel Jansen with Sauk-Prairie Professional Services. So we are the on-site contractor that does all the groundwater monitoring for the Army, does landfill monitoring. So quite a few of the things that you see out there, our office is on site on Ho-Chunk property. So just to start off, a little bit of background. This is a photo of when the buildings were there. So most of the buildings you see that used to be out there are all gone. Our office used to be the fire station, and there is still an art history right next to us that the Ho-Chunk uses as an art studio. So for those of you who don't know, from World War II in 42 to Vietnam in 75, the ammunition plant was under operations during Vietnam, Korea, and World War II. They made propellants. So dinitrophenylene is the main concern left over from the propellant manufacturing process. So no more land, all it has been transferred. So the last land was transferred to the township, and that went to cemetery. And then there's another cemetery that went to the USDA. So USDA, DNR, Ho-Chunk, and then where the sanitary treatment plant is, that went to Bluffview, which is still within the town of Sumter. So there were, like the big map back there, as you saw, and this is a very small version of that that's in the proposed plan, showing the 4 different plumes. So we have the propellant burning ground on the bottom left, and that goes out towards the Wisconsin River. We have the nitrocellulose plume, which is in the northwest corner on Ho-Chunk property. We have the deterrent burning ground, which is in the upper right near Wiggins Bay. That's the narrowest plume. And then we have the central plume in the middle, and that heads down towards the Gruber's Grove Bay area. So with this, the shapes that you see in some of the future maps, just realize that the boundaries you see are the Wisconsin preventive action limit. So that is a warning sign number that they use in their state standards. The enforcement standard is the drinking water number. We are using that PAL lower number to draw where the plume boundaries are. So just keep that in mind as we're seeing some of those maps, but just that limit of extent is not, you can't drink all of that water. It's just that is where we need to be concerned for monitoring. So we'll start off with the propellant burning ground. So, oh wow, I guess I didn't realize how bad that graphic was. But this is the actual map from the proposed plan report. It shows the sampled wells that are moving down from the top of the map where the waste pits were. And then the red boundary is the plant boundary that was originally there. And then it's heading down towards below the dam, the Prairie du Sac Dam of Alliant. So the the main contaminants that exceed the drinking water standard in Wisconsin is the enforcement standard. That is carbon tetrachloride, and that has a standard of 5 parts per billion, is UGL. Ethyl ether, which is 1,000 parts per billion. The total D&T of all 6 isomers is 0.05 parts per billion. And then you have 2,4 and 2,6 individually, and those are also at 0.05 parts per billion. And then you have TCE, or trichoethylene, and that is at 5 parts per billion. So those are all contaminants that have exceedances above these enforcement standards within the propellant burning ground plume. So now we move to just looking at D&T. So this particular map has very specific coloration for the green is where it is just the PAL. So this could be individual isomers or all 6 D&T isomers that we're showing there, 2,4, 2,3, 2,5. Most prevalent are the 2,4 and 2,6 isomers of D&T. So then you have the blue. So anywhere you see where you have the blue, that is definitely exceeded the enforcement standard in those wells. Some of those are just a few wells within that circle. This is all data that is as recent as 2023 and continues to be updated. We're keeping monitoring every 2 or 6 months. But the orange, which is very in the upper right box, there's a small zones there near the source areas. The green is there's a racetrack, and there's the propellant burning ground where they had the waste pits, and then there's a landfill up there. So the orange is the concentration that goes from 0.5 to 5 parts per billion for total D&T. And then the pink is a smaller area, and that is anything that had been above 5 parts per billion for total D&T. And you can see that there is a break of the D&T portion of this plume. So if you were looking at the previous map and you saw a plume that went all the way down to the river, this is saying that the D&T portion that is above the enforcement standard is just to the edge of the property. There is not any exceedances of D&T offsite. Those would be for the chlorinated solvents that I was mentioning. So now we're going to just move to the deterrent burning ground plume. This is a map showing the monitoring wells that we are currently testing. I will point out, it's easier to see this, there's red triangles there of the residential wells that were tested even in 2023. And this shows frequencies. There are wells that are sampled quarterly near the front edge of the plume off to the far right near Wiggins Bay. And then most of the wells in this plume are sampled twice a year, which is semi-annually. And the contamination that we are really focused on here is total D&T. There's a little bit of sulfate, and that is at landfill 5, which is at the very top of the map. It's not shown, but sulfate is exceeding the enforcement standard around this old landfill. But it is not reached, like off-site down to my drinking wells. So this plume is not specifically sulfate, it's just D&T. So here is the same map, which is basically the boundary that you just saw, but it's now showing different concentrations for the D&T. So we have the green and a little bit of halo around the blue. So the green is just the PAL. The blue is the enforcement standard, so that is the drinking water standard. So that boundary is there. The red dots you can see, those are the wells that were being sampled. The red is anything that would have been above 1 part per billion. And then the site had a new well nest put in on the down gradient side, closer to Highway 78, which is the road that winds up there, and that well has been clean. We've been mentioning at previous RAB meetings, we're going to continue to monitor those wells for down gradient potential migration, and that's the direction of water flow is towards Wiggins Bay. And that those well nests contain to be clean for any DNT or solvents. So the red is up there by the source area. That is the deterrent burning ground waste pits. Landfill 5 is shown on that map. So the red dots that you see at the top where landfill 5, it's a trapezoid, that's where the sulfate detections are being detected. Sulfate is not high within the deterrent burning ground area itself. So now on to some central plume information. This plume is D&T only monitored. We do not have any chlorinated solvent detections of any concern with this plume. So this boundary you see is the PAL exceedance. And there is another map later in the presentation that shows, I think it's the next one, that shows where the D&T is above the enforcement standard. Most of the wells here are sampled annually. The wells that are down at the bottom, which is Gruber's Grove Bay and Water's Edge subdivision is shown there, those wells are sampled twice a year. And then you can see the residential wells as a red triangle, and everybody within the Water's Edge subdivision proper right now is being tested. So now where is the D&T within the central plume? So the green is the same plume boundary which is shown, but now the blue is showing where the enforcement standard is above for total D&T. And this plume has been shrinking over the last few years. This is from 2023 data, so all of the information you've been seeing. The information we sent out for 2024 was June. It showed very similar results, that there is no more down gradient monitoring wells closer to the water's edge that would be exceeding the enforcement standard for D&T. The nitrocellulose plume, that is the one that is on the Ho-Chunk property. It's one of the smallest. It's the newest plume. It's limited in scope. It's only been for monitoring for D&T. There's some annual, some semi-annual wells. This plume at the moment can only go towards the propellant burning ground. It cannot get off site. It has to go through the entire propellant burning ground proper before it could ever reach off site. So it's probably about 2 miles away from leaving the property at the moment. So there are currently two wells in the red dot with there in the blue for the enforcement standard. There have been another well to the north that had been an enforcement standard in the past. Yes. Yeah, we're going to pause for initial questions at this time.
I did have one question online.
Yeah, go ahead. Oh, are you on mute? Oh, can you unmute your microphone, Laura? Laura, oh, we're just starting to hear you now. Oh, she doesn't have any questions? Oh, okay. Any questions from the audience so far? Chris?
Yeah, I've got one, and that is, on the central plume, we just showed DNT. There are some VOCs that show up at the panel level and above, down in water's edge, and they replaced several wells down there. Chloroform comes to mind. Why doesn't that show up here?
Yeah, there are chloroform detections down in the water's edge. None of the chloroform has been above the enforcement standard, and we haven't found a chloroform like source area gradient. So as far as it being recognized as something that we can draw a plume for, that never really has been realized, unless it is something that we can see up gradient or that it has enforcement standard exceedances. The history of it has nothing. So we haven't been able to draw that.
I know we haven't identified the source area, but it doesn't mean it isn't there.
Oh, yeah.
I just don't want to get lost in the discussion.
Yeah, we're constantly, so all those residential wells are tested for volatile organics, which has chloroform plus dinitrophthalate, to make sure that we're monitoring if there is a situation. We're not positive if the chloroform is from the same source zone as on site with the DNT. We just don't have that. From the years that we've been testing, we don't have the information that says chloroform came from here. It's only found down in that region, I guess. Does that help? Sorry.
Well, even if it wasn't on the plume, could you mark it on the side of the map so people would know that it was there, or on the documentation? I mean, there's no plume for it, but...
So far what I know is that it's just down near that water's edge area that there are chloroform detections that are above this PAL number. I guess I don't have, you're thinking of right now, I don't have the means to put that on the slide right now.
No, I'm not saying right now, I'm saying like a future presentation or something.
Oh, we can consider that.
Okay.
Well, I guess a follow-up is the 3 or 4 wells that the Army's replaced in the last 20 years at water's edge, what was exceeded there that caused them to replace them?
It was 2.4 or 2.6 DNT. Yeah. Yeah, there's been 3 wells replaced within the water's edge.
That was quite some time ago. What was the latest one, or was it, how long ago was it?
The latest one, I think, was within 5 years ago. And then before that, it would be almost 20 years ago. Any other questions before we move on?
The more recent well that was replaced, was it a shallower well, or was it a deeper well, and that was better, or what was actually done?
Yeah, all the wells that have been replaced were at about the exact same depth in the sand. And then the last one that was replaced was drilled into the bedrock. Sure. Oh, I am on this one. Okay. So just go over some actions that the Army has done in response, just vary on risk. So risk-derived remediations, soil remediation, the propellant burning ground, the deterrent burning ground, the sewers around buildings, lots of different regions within the Badger plant that have had soil remedial actions, and that was all hauled to the on-site landfill. At the propellant burning ground, you had the soil vapor extraction, you had a bioremediation system, You had the deterrent burning ground had a in situ bioremediation system for soil. And then all the different landfills that have been capped or covered with soil, clay, or other membranes to restrict any additional water to be getting into any contamination that may remain in that area. So we've had the interim remedial measure, which started in 1990 at the propellant burning ground. And then in 1997 approximately, 95, was the MERM. But all of that was shut down by 2016. So that was just pumping water from the sand and gravel within the propellant burning ground plume. All of that action was allowed to cease with approval by the DNR, and all of those extraction wells and systems were removed at that time. We've talked about some residential well replacement. There's been 1 well replaced within the deterrent burning ground plume, 3 within the central plume, and it should be 3 within the propellant burning ground plume offsite. The propellant burning ground plume happened much longer ago, back in the 90s. And then all the different land use controls that were put in place when all the property was being transferred, digging restrictions, use of water, residential use is not allowed on the property. So to reduce any potential exposure, if any of the owners need something, they need to come to the Army with about if they're going to be digging in a potential area, so that there would be any risk or knowledge that the Army might have an impact in that region. So we're talking about overall CERCLA process. So now that we are using a CERCLA process for our groundwater monitoring and remediation program, we are currently doing a proposed plan. So soliciting public comments is part of that procedure after we post the proposed plan. The first step for this part of it had been totally skipped because that would have been done in the 80s or 90s. Remedial investigation, we are still doing installing wells if that is necessary. There will probably still be monitoring wells that are going to be installed. So we're not done installing things, looking for where the problem could be moving or going. And then feasibility study of the alternatives, which we had already conducted in 2021. And the record of decision, that would be the next step. So once we have all the public comments coming together, we'll summarize all those, and then it reiterates what the proposed plan is and responds to those comments within a called a responsiveness summary. There was a similar action during the RIFS in 2021, where comments from the DNR, the public, and RAB members were summarized within a document. So there will be something very similar to that within the record of decision. That is the document that is signed by the Army to proceed with doing the next level of remedial action. So this is just a standard CERCLA guide that any agency or Superfund site would use. And then, of course, once you're doing your action, you have laboratory tests, the bench testing, you're doing pilot tests to try to figure out your design, because probably people have heard that we have not done some of those testings previously before this remedial action. So those testings will occur before the remedial design is finalized. And then you're implementing, and then you're doing additional monitoring as you're even working on the remediation. So that's the overall plan of where it's going to be in the future also. So just a little bit of background. So 1980, started doing the investigations and evaluating that contamination did exist in the groundwater at Badger. There is a gap here, just so you know, the gap between 80 and 2011 is that the CERCLA process wasn't being followed strictly at that time. It was probably using more of a RCRA format, which is more of a state. So this particular background is not an entire site history. So in 2011, there was a plan. There was no human health risk assessment with that alternative feasibility study. The remedy was going to be just monitored natural attenuation. There was not going to be any treatment to any of the groundwater plumes. That was going to be the municipal water system for the residents around Badger, and they would get drinking water from some deep aquifer wells off-site. In 2017, we had some very large meetings and informed people that we were not going to be installing the public water system and that we were going to be restarting up the RIFS process for groundwater to potentially evaluate if there was sufficient risk to determine remedial action. So that was done with this next phase. So the risk evaluated the worst case scenario for each plume, regardless if that compound was in the same well or in different wells. So we looked at a cumulative evaluation. We are going to provide a slide that has all that risk criteria. And so we looked at current risk, and that would be people that are currently drinking the water, any wells that are outside of the boundary that can drill a well. And then hypothetical risk is people that are the wells that are on site. So the Army has restrictions about drinking the water on site, but that if that water could migrate then to private land off site, and then it could be consumed. So that's hypothetical, that it may eventually make it to a residence or land that could have a well drilled on it. And then we've talked about the 2021, we did do a remedial investigation feasibility study that did have alternatives for cleaning up the groundwater. We worked on in 2023, the HRA is a new risk assessment. So that risk assessment brought in data updated from 2019 to 2023. So it reevaluated the risk because the previous risk assessment ended in 2018. So everyone wanted to have newer information to see if there was any different risk currently that would affect residents. So that's what we're going to be talking about, is that is the updated information that is in the proposed plan. So this is the, okay, you can read it really good. On my screen, it's much smaller. So each plume is organized from top to bottom. The blue area is the plume. So we have a cumulative cancer risk, and then you have a non-cancer index, HI, and then on the far right is the contaminants of concern that were identified in the risk assessment. So we have a difference between if it's on-site, which is hypothetical, which I mentioned, it could migrate, and then we have off-site, which are currently areas that people could be drinking the water. So that's the way that things are broken up in between each plume. So we have bolded numbers that are above the risk criteria. The risk criteria are different. We're different for on-site versus off-site. The Army is allowed to use under CERCLA a risk range of 10 to the minus 4 to 10 to the minus 6 for on-site risk. So anything on-site that is between that 10 to the minus 4 and 10 to the minus 6 would not exceed. So if you could look at central plume has 3 times 10 to the minus 6, so that does not exceed the 10 to the minus 4 for on-site that the Army can use. So that is why that is not bolded. Anything over 1, regardless if it was on-site or off-site that use that information, anything 1 or over is in exceedance of that risk range for non-cancer. So D&T does have a cancer and non-cancer hazard. So part of the calculations, that product is in both of those calculations. So it's not just one or the other. So the on-site portion of the propellant burning ground has, 10 to the minus 2, much higher than 10 to the minus 4, and 120 for the HI, and that is mostly driven by dinitrotoluene, those values. And then off-site, you still have, it's above 10 to the minus 6, and off-site, you still have a risk range above 1. The deterrent burning ground on-site does have the HI at 5, and then off-site, it still has above 10 to the minus 6, and then at 1, so that exceeds. The central plume does not have an on-site risk that is high enough. The off-site risk is above the 10 to the minus 6 at 10 to the minus 5. And then the nitrocellulose plume does not exceed the risk range. It was only at 2 times 10 to the minus 6, so it is not classified up there in the 10 to the minus 4 for on-site. And therefore, that did not receive any, that plume does not have any contaminants of concern. This is based on risk. This is not the remediation, just so you're evaluating. This is the risk evaluation to determine if you should be remediating. So there is, the central plume does have risk associated with the off-site and total D&T, and it does, chloroform was part of that. So if you're thinking of questions, just hold them for a little bit in case that one's like, that may have a question. So the groundwater remedial action objectives, so this is a very standard CERCLA, is to protect human health, prevent exposure to the contaminated groundwater, and then restore the groundwater aquifer, wherever that may be, to beneficial reuse, if that's on or off site, and then minimize the contaminated groundwater on any of the environmental factors. And then those objectives will be achieved when those risk-based contaminants of concern that we were showing are below the cleanup level. So we are using either the EPA maximum contaminant levels. D&T does not exist on the EPA's list, but Wisconsin does have the enforcement standard that we've been talking about. And so if it's below that cleanup level, that is part of the remedial action objective. So now we move from where it's just about risk, that we are discussing that there is the enforcement standards for D&T. So just keep that in mind, that it's not just because there's a risk range, that's not the cleanup. That's to determine that we can proceed with cleanup. Is the risk, that's why you do the risk assessment. This is showing the generality of where the alternatives were being screened and just listing them out. There is going to be some more slides where we're going to have those. So you have no action, which is required to have, which isn't really going to do anything. Then you have monitored natural attenuation, which is sampling and monitoring where the plume might go. And then in case you have a well that needs to be replaced, then you would replace that drinking water well, but you don't do any remediation. And then you have active groundwater remediation, pump and treat, which is what we did with the propellant burning ground. That was evaluated. And then you include with that monitoring and providing water or a new well for someone. And then you have the restrictions of the land for installing wells, and you keep that going. And those are kind of continuous through. Then the fourth one is the active anaerobic bioremediation. That's the in situ that we're going to be talking about, the selected option. And you could just go with well replacement, and that is only just looking at the residence of wells. And then you have source area treatment, which is just for the deterrent burning ground and propellant burning ground. And then you'd be treating just the hot spots in there. So EPA's guidance for CERCLA has these 9 criteria to evaluate all of these alternatives. So you have overall protection of human health and the environment, compliance with ARRs, which is a complicated term about code for like groundwater standards, other things related to if there's wetlands involved, other ecological receptors depending on your project. And then you have, is it long-term effective? Is it permanent? Are you actually removing everything? Like say excavation removes the material, that's permanent. And then are you reducing the toxicity? Are you stopping the contamination from moving? And how much contamination can you remove with the volume of what you're doing? Is it just short term? Is it create an initial impact right away from doing the remediation? How fast can you implement it? Is it technology available? Does it take too much equipment? And then just cost. You have to get a cost estimate together, and that's just one of the things that you balance between what you're going to do. Doesn't mean that the cheapest cost is always the right one to do. It's just part of the evaluation. And then depending on state and community acceptance is the last criteria of each alternative. Okay, after those. So the first evaluation is the propellant burning ground plume. So we're explaining, again, some of the alternatives 1 through 6. So this one had the source treatment for alternative 6. So some of those same parameters that we were talking about, they are on the top. The protection, compliance, shows the cost. This includes a cost evaluation of if it's high preference. So the cheapest cost for, like your car is cheapest, that's what you'd want. But is that car the best car? Would you want the Toyota that's going to last longer, or do you want something that's going to be sports car? And I'm like, that's going to be my bang for the buck. That's going to be quick, but it's really expensive. So you got to kind of evaluate all of those scenarios as you're looking through it. So we give it a high, medium, and low for preference. So let's take a look at between like pump and treat and anaerobic bioremediation. That's the in situ. So you have a lot of highs for alternative 3, and then you have 1 medium for implementability, and then the acceptance are all to be determined. Will the state accept that? And then you have a cost of, it's a little more expensive potentially for pump and treat, and that's what an L is, so it's a little higher. And then the injection is a little bit cheaper. The difference between them is, even though you see that there's an H and an M for anaerobic and differences in long-term permanence and effectiveness, you are going to have to run the pump and treat for a very long time based on previous study. I mean, the pump and treat that we ran for 20-some years. The permanence of the in situ, though, will be more aggressive, that you will destroy everything within the range that you're putting your in situ product. So there won't be any D&T left. So there is a little bit of variables between that, but so you're evaluating between the two. The cost of the in situ does look a little more favorable for pump and treat. Those two have the highest qualities of the scale. Anaerobic bioremediation is definitely the one that would win out because it is going to be permanent and you won't have buildings on site. You won't be pumping for decades to come. You will be able to try to treat it in a much faster way. So just a little bit of why you come through this evaluation. Well replacement is very low because it removes nothing. You don't treat any plume. You just go out and replace wells whenever you want. Kind of the way that somebody might think about the way we've been running, like the deterrent burning ground plume or something. We'll wait, and we're not treating it yet, and if somebody gets a contaminated well, we'll replace it. But this would actually be injecting to try to treat it. And then just monitoring, that has a lot of low marks because you're not going to treat the plume either. So some of these similarities are going to be with the next two plumes. So the deterrent burning ground has a very similar marks for like anaerobic bioremediation. That's the in situ. And then pump and treat. We've never pump and treat tried at the deterrent burning ground. It is a finer grain material, so you would remove less water. It would probably be more expensive in the long run. The cost turned out to be pretty similar, but you would have a lot more long-term costs with pump and treat, and you probably would have more monitoring in the end. But in situ still would win out because it is going to be a permanent solution. And then you could get rid of the D&T much faster. So the dollars there you see, that's in million. So if you had, so that's 12.5 million is the proposed cost, including groundwater monitoring until the remediation. And the remediation mean that D&T would be treated below the enforcement standard of 0.05, on-site or off-site for the deterrent burning ground plume. So the central plume does not have a known source area that is something that we can put our finger on, so that does not have that alternative. But very similar marks between pump and treat, which is active treatment, anaerobic, active. Those are the only two treatment options that were being evaluated for active. This one does have a higher cost for anaerobic bioremediation. As you can see, 23.7 million. The reason that cost was so high that you may say, well, it was only 12.5 for the deterrent burning ground is just the size of the plume. And if you are trying to treat the entire area that had the exceedance, you would have to do that much more injections and a lot more just involved. Now, it may not be as impactful, but that's why the costs seem so much higher. It's a more diverse plume that's spread out. Is this our, yes, this is the next time for questions. So anything that may have questions between the last time and now. Randy.
Yes.
Fulman.
2021 cost estimates, how do you feel about those costs today? Assuming they increase.
Yeah, there's always going to be an increase. It was the best estimate that you could at the time for like what the products would be, you know, like carbon costs if you used granular activated carbon for pump and treat. Yeah, they'll have to go up. Some of them you may be able to revise where you actually have to inject to try to figure that out. But these costs are just to evaluate. This is not like, we don't anticipate that this is the exact cost that the Army would have to spend. But this is a long-term cost, not something that would cost in 1 year. or even 2 years. It's going to be many years to accumulate that amount of money. So, of course, then, as it goes, then your cost for those products might increase even as you're doing the remediation. I think there's an online question.
I would like to try grab number Laura, once again, I think we may have figured out the volume problem.
Go ahead, Laura.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. As you know, the DNR has submitted at least 3 formal comment letters on the proposed plan for site-wide groundwater and has participated in countless meetings with the Army. Could you explain which recommendations relevant to risk have been rejected by the Army pertaining to known or potential carcinogens?
Was it which contaminants or?
Which recommendations of DNR?
Oh, their recommendations, okay.
Yes, DNR submitted
Oh,
comments. I
boy.
understand there's a number of recommendations that have been rejected by the Army.
I don't have a summary of that in front of me, Kwan.
Yeah, I think the main recommendations that DNR provided and that we did not agree with would be the how we calculate risk, which is we are using the risk-based EPA risk-based CERCLA policies to identify what risk we have based on the 10 to minus 4 to 10 to minus 6 range, acceptable range, whereas DNR uses their state regulations, which dictates that all groundwater has to be risked at the 10 to the minus 6. So that's where the main disagreement of that particular item.
And that just pertains to the central plume and the nitrocellulose.
Well, it's actually, it pertains to all plumes.
Yes.
It does pertain to all plumes, but in the end, though, I just want to, say that the risk drive, like Joel mentioned, the risk calculation drives if a potential action is needed or not. And in this case, regardless if we are going with a 10 to minus 4 or 10 to minus 6, the Army is still proposing to do actions for 3 of the 4 plumes. The only thing that is disconnect is that for our risk analysis, it identifies certain chemical concerns listed for each of those plumes, whereas if we were to use the 10 to minus 6 that the DNR suggested, it would add some more chemical concerns to that list. But in the end, though, the Army is still planning to do a remedy regardless of what number of COCs there is. And to expand further, those COCs are all within the same kind of constituents family. So when we would be treating with EBO or whatever technology, we were anticipating that it would be treating not just the Army COCs list, but also all the other COCs that the DNR identifies. Hopefully that answers your question, Laura.
All right. So the Army is going to not comply with groundwater enforcement standards because for the state of Wisconsin, the Army's taking issue with that.
Not for risk calculations, but when we get to the actual remedy of it, as Joel mentioned on the remedial action objectives, that we will be cleaning up to the state standard, the enforcement standards.
Yes. For the central, the DBG, and the PBG plumes. Dennis, you have a question?
Well, not really. Because in 2020, DNR because I have a timeline here actually provided by the DNR. And in 2024, the Army submitted revised draft proposed plan for site-wide groundwater. The Army states they will not accept DNR's 2024 comments, and this version of the proposed plan will be released for public comment. And then in 2020, there was recommendations specific to the nitrocellulose plume, and the chemicals of concern were not identified, but I maintain that the Army does not intend to comply with groundwater enforcement standards that the rest of us have to comply with. And based on the position that the Army wants to follow CERCLA, for example, the Army wants to clean up to a different standard on-site rather than off-site, and state law requires that all groundwater everywhere in the state comply with groundwater standards. The state. That's the end of my statement. Thank you.
Dennis, you have a question?
I actually have a series of questions related to alternate 2. I'm not implying that this is something I'm advocating for. I'm trying to get clarity on it. So my first question is, what's the half-life of DNT? Is it a really long time?
So the all 6 isomers act very differently. So the degradation of 2,4 and 2,6 is going to be much faster than we've seen than the other 4 isomers. But I do not know that there's been an official calculated half-life. It's just not a compound that's studied like that. I think people have tried to do laboratory studies to do that, but I'm not aware of anything that I could put my finger on.
We probably need to assume it's a pretty long half-life.
So I guess you could look at the longevity of how long the contamination may have started at some of the Badger locations and how persistent it's maintained within the plume. And I guess you could make your own non-scientific discovery. But yeah, I mean, since the 70s, there hasn't been any release of any contamination at the site.
Right. So I want a little bit of a history lesson, because it's my understanding that the alternative water supply, well, first of all, the alternative water supply, you're talking about actually running a water line, basically, right?
No, this is not a water system.
What are you talking about?
Either you're providing them bottled water or you're drilling them a new well.
Okay, gotcha. The idea of running a pipeline and supplying community water was ruled out
Correct.
by the Army Environmental Command, that they can't spend money on that? Is that the idea, or what was the...
It didn't actually clean up the site.
Right, okay. So essentially what we're saying is that alternative 2 is not really feasible.
Yeah, it doesn't, it only prevents people from drinking the water, but it doesn't actually remediate any of that. It continues for a very long time. Yeah, Michael.
The BDNR have anything to say about the Army not living, DOD not living up to what the state requires? Are we okay with that?
Yeah, so we've been in discussion with the Army, like Laura had mentioned, a number of times. I know we have 3 written comments that we provided to the Army. And then we're, during the public comment period, we'll also provide additional comments to that aspect. So it's a disagreement certainly, but I don't think that the conversation's over by any means from our standpoint. And that's why we continue to try to bring the Army back to the table and provide these written comments too.
Any other questions before we proceed? Okay, we'll go over some ideas and information about the alternative 4, the preferred alternative for each of the plumes, which is the in situ anaerobic bioremediation. So that's an active technology. This technology is used widely with chlorinated solvent plumes across the country. There is usage of this technology for explosives. It's not on, I'll just get that out there now, is that, so for explosives, there aren't a lot of sites in the country that have explosive groundwater contamination. But this technology, Husker, Nebraska, and that's an Army facility for RDX and TNT. At Hawthorne Army Depot in Texas, and they have RDX contamination. And at Pantech Superfund site, that's a very large site in Texas, Amarillo area. They have HMX, RDX, TNT, and the 2,4 and 2,6 DNT listed within their COC list that they're treating. So they are, like this Pantech site, they have used this EVO, so vegetable oil injecting. So I know that there have been previous questions about what other sites, was it just Cornhusker at some RAB meetings, so I did get this information from one local vendor that their product has been used at these sites. Their TCAP, or their Cornhusker was back in about 2008 timeframe is when they had been supplying their product to that site specifically. But they were using it for this in situ method. So you're either using some existing wells, but our plan is to use a lot of new construction. So you're trying to do this within more of a temporary system throughout. Obviously, there's a lot of farmland out there on Badger that doesn't want to have wells installed every so much distance. So it's got standard equipment, drilling equipment. You're using tanker trucks or smaller containers of the product. You're using water that either you pump from the ground or you bring in your own water to mix. So when you're not treating anything, there's nothing really to see. There's no building that stays on site. So depends on where you're drilling. Some of the Badger, I've drilled out here many times, and some of it's a little challenging. The depths that you're trying to reach, over 100 feet often, that can be challenging. Not many sites have to deal with this. A lot of sites are looking at groundwater that's less than 50 feet. Ours is typically over 100 feet. So hence the cost of all this was budgeted within the estimates, but it is very labor intensive once you're drilling to get down to the zone. So effectiveness, it changes the environment. Right now we have an aerobic environment. Pretty much most of the Badger groundwater is aerobic, and that's pretty much where you want your water to be if you're going to drink it. There is anaerobic bacteria that are in like bedrock, and there's a lot of places that you just can't drink the water. It's just very smelly. We've sampled some of the bedrock wells that we have, and you can tell that this water is more anaerobic. It is void of oxygenation. So this does change that reaction from oxygenated to very little oxygen, and that's where these bacteria and the remediation will take place within these zones, these treatment zones. So this graphic is trying to give an impression of that you're going to be pushing the water down into a well. It's going to be radiating out. This particular one on the top right is showing your trailer, and then you might take water from a nearby well to mix. There are people that do that a lot. We haven't determined at this time if that would be something we would do. That would be during the design, if you take water from one well to use to apply your treatment and then add your mixture to it. So it does permanently destroy. So you do need to verify that it is destroying, and that is not something you do in a few months. It's going to take some time, and people are not going to be convinced that it is treated right away. So you're going to definitely need to monitor this to make sure that you don't need to then retreat. And there are people that are required at sites to go back and retreat areas if their contaminants were too high. They do apply the similar product, and then maybe they change where they inject it to then treat. So you do need to do the monitoring to evaluate where you might find this treatment. So long term, if you do destroy it all, then at least in that monitoring period, it's not going to be there again. And then you verify this with all of your groundwater monitoring program after your treatment is done, that you haven't had any additional D&T that would be migrating away from your zone that had the enforcement standard. So we are looking at the enforcement standard, just remember where we're thinking of this. So here's some graphics about EVO is what's mentioned in there. There are other products related to EVO, vegetable oil, could be soybean oil, but it is food grade. So there's the amendment, they call it the biochemical product. And with that, you add surfactants. So surfactant, I got on here, it's commonly used in the food industry. If you search for surfactants in food on the internet, you'd come up with bread, all kinds of things that are already stuff you're eating. So it's not something that would be poisonous that you're putting into it. It's just a way to change the surface tension. So the oil matter that you have, that product will want to stick to the grains, and that's where the other product, the contamination, is sticking right now. So it's holding on to the grain, and it's staying there, and it's not all moving with the plume. So the plumes stay around long time here because it's staying to the soil, and so you're trying to get this material to stay in the same area and then create the reaction to destroy the nitrated D&T. D&T is a very nitrated compound, and this works with nitrate very effectively. So it breaks that nitrate down all the way. So a few of the graphics are showing is the purple is just you're showing some injections. There's a radius of influence, so you pump it out into the ground. It's not going hundreds of feet. It's going much smaller. So you do need to evaluate that before you go out and do the remediation of how far out you can push that product so it's effective, so the radius. And then there is some of that down gradient effect. You're actually hoping that there is some movement with the water of the biochemical product that you injected so you can create a bigger influence. You don't want it to be just a little circles everywhere and drilling everywhere. You want it to move a little bit. So that's going to take some time that you will monitor it after you inject. The bottom left graphic is showing if you were treating a source, very pinpoint, trying to really destroy that area. The one on the right is if you had more of a line. And if you looked at some of the documents you've seen, that it looks like they're more of a line injections that we have. So this particular example is saying, what if those are permanent lines? Ours, we're looking at are temporary across the plume in, top to bottom. And there's really no, products that you're using, harmful initially to the environment. And then it's fact that we're not putting a building up. It's just more of a green remediation from destroying it, and just you're done with it once it's remediated. You're not coming back to do any additional treatment. So I got two more that are talking about, or one more that's talking about D&T here. So it is an active treatment. So we do have this, I call it the design wheel. And I did not come up with this. This is a national organization. And so I do have the reference down at the bottom. It's the Interstate Technology Regulatory Council. So they evaluate lots of technologies for remediation. They look at monitoring natural attenuation, how to drill wells. This document is very effective to review. So some of this graphic is from them. And so what they're talking about is that, so you have this design and you say, well, we're going to do these injections. What do you know about it yet? Well, we need to go out and do a bench scale test study. So we need to go to the laboratory, give them some soil, give them some water, give them the amendments that we're proposing to use, and a lot of them, and evaluate them to figure out what we can learn. So they're going to come up with, does it destroy the D&T? How much does it destroy? Can they tweak the process so it can get better? Then you go out and you try to go in the ground before you remediate, and you're testing some of those things that you saw that worked in the lab. Then you're also rethinking about what's working. Is the stuff that you're putting in the ground too viscous? Is it going too far? Is it too solid that it won't pump? Is it not working? Is there something else you can move? So you're moving through this circular, you're going back and saying, we need to do some other tests. It's not breaking down fast enough. Maybe it's not distributed in the aquifer now as you're trying to push it out. And so you're thinking about all of that and then going back to the drawing board. This is all while you're doing the design. So you haven't even remediated anything yet, you're just testing. And then during the design, so you started a plume and you have all this information, but something's still not working. Many people I've talked to are like, yeah, they went out there and the pump's not strong enough. It can't pump to 150 feet. Oh, we need to come up with something different. Okay, now it's too cold. The lines are too small. There's all these different plumbing situations now that you didn't figure out before because maybe you did your pilot test in the spring and somebody told you had to do it in the winter. Now you got to come up with all these different things. So you think about all this while you're constantly redefining what it looks like to improve the remediation. So it's different than just going out and digging a hole and excavating it. You got to constantly be evaluating all the groundwater parameters, looking at where the reaction is that you're trying to get. So we're going to go back to a little bit of specifics about the plumes. So for these next figures, this is where the remedial action will happen. So we're talking about enforcement standard. So we have the blue. So the D&T plume thickness is around 100 feet thick at the most. So you do have to do, these are vertical injections. So you have to get in the vertical profile throughout the plume. And so there's treatment lines shown. These are approximate, and you have to design that to figure out how far the plume might travel. Will this be effective? And the same thing with the deterrent burning ground. That's about a 55-foot maximum thickness once you get to where the D&T is at the top of the water table. The treatment lines are much closer here because there's a slower groundwater table. And so if it to move, you'd have to put a lot more treatment lines in to remediate the entire plume. The central plume, this particular map is now from 2023, and so this is a much smaller plume that we had shown for where the enforcement standard is, but still lots of wider treatment lines. This is less treatment lines than was in the cost estimate that I had showed you from 2021. But we can't update the cost estimate yet. That's not a concern for the Army about what that is. This is the action that they're choosing to go to. And so this one is also 100 feet thick at the deepest point. So this layer of D&T contamination is estimating at 100 feet, even below the water table, that it could be that deep. So there is a zone that is pretty thick in there. And that's mostly up closer to the north, far away from that south end.
How much smaller could
2021. You said it was smaller, and just even a guess at what percentage smaller it is?
I'll take this question on it. We're almost through. So we did have the plume all the way to the plant boundary, the red line, before. We did have some wells that were off-site that did have a D&T exceedance, very small, but it had been consistent. And then because the wells that we had replaced in the past, those had D&T exceedances above the enforcement standard. So the plume, the blue area would have been drawn all the way down in the same by those residences. But we have not, even the monitoring wells we haven't seen those exceedances recently.
The wells that you replaced, did you continue to monitor the ones that were the older ones?
We did have an older well, but the homeowner wanted us to remove it from their yard. We did use one of them for a while, but we put a new well in that was deeper, and he didn't want the old one anymore. But, so we don't have, they didn't want them to stay on the property. So this is my last slide, specifically, technically, then we can have questions again. So the public comment period is still going to be going on, and then we're going to look at all those public comments. We're going to respond to those and provide that within this responsive summary, which is in the record of decision. So that's the next document that the Army signs. And that will put in the alternative specifically that the Army would put forward. And then we're talking about these design parameters of pilot testing and stuff before you start getting into your construction. And so there's plenty of time between now and some of those actions. None of the actions that we're talking about, like these pilot tests or something, none of those are planned for this current year at this moment. So we're going to be having a decision document, and the Army has to get that through the Pentagon first before they can authorize any funding to do with these other part of the projects. So last chance for questions before we would move to the official comment period. Yeah.
When you start the phase 1 and end the phase 3, how many years are you talking?
When you start like the design or start injecting?
No, actual start of phase 1, 2, and 3.
So
you're talking about 5 years?
That's possible, because you may also be evaluating, did you learn something when you first started in one plume that you should apply to the other plume, so you make it more efficient. So you do want to try to learn something right away. So you're probably not going to go and do it all right away in the same year. So yeah, 5 years is very possible.
And when do you start the first drill?
Well, first you're going to spend time doing the bench scale testing, but you're going to actually have to drill to obtain the soil that you want from that aquifer and the water, which is easily, but you're going to want to get that soil, and then you're going to do the lab analysis.
So you're talking starting that 2026, maybe?
That is possible, yeah. Yeah, that's the first step, is doing the lab part. And then I would imagine you'd be looking at possibly another year, and then once you find all of your studies, and then going out. Now, there is a DNR requirement for injecting that we would still have to go through. They do have permits in place for re-injecting into the ground. So it's not just a bubble of Army deciding. There's still a lot of procedures that the DNR requires for doing stuff like that.
What is your budget on this whole project?
These were just the estimates. There's no budget plan yet. that's something,
We haven't made a decision yet, so the record of decision, okay, so we are in the public comment period, that doesn't end until the end of February, and then we have to prepare the record of decision and the responsiveness summary, and then we have to get it coordinated through the Pentagon, and then we go to WDNR, and they may have comments back to us, and we do the back and forth between DNR and the Army. It takes time. It's going to take quite a bit of time. But once we have the record of decision that this is what we're going to do, that's when we set the budget, we see how much money is available to us then. Because, you know, some years there's lots of funding, some years there's not lots of funding. And it just depends on when we get to that point, that's when we know what we can do in each year.
So we don't know really when we start or when we end right now.
Not right now, no. Because we haven't even designed what we're going to do.
Right.
So we are still in the very early stages. So yeah, we don't really know when we will start and when we will finish until we get the design in place. And, well, first until we get the documents approved, and then the design in place, and then we
And you
can
got
tell
to get
you
the
then.
money every year.
Exactly.
You have to apply each year for
Yes.
those fundings.
Yes, funding only lasts 1 year.
Chris? Yeah.
Yeah, to follow along on this issue of the timeline, I mean, you previously said that you've done this in other areas. So extrapolating from those experiences, I would think you should be able to provide at least some gross timeline for bench testing, pilot study, and then getting to the point of full implementation. I mean, to me, 5 years is probably optimistic, quite honestly. I think we're looking at 10, maybe 15 years at least in this. I guess I would like to see that in the document. But when you get to full implementation, there's some other issues that I didn't see in the document and I haven't heard discussed. And one of those is a lot of that land, unless you reserve the right to go and do this in the land transfer documents, you've got to go back and get surface agreements with the 4-H, Wisconsin DNR, and I looked this afternoon at Wisconsin DNR's master plan for this area. This was not envisioned. So is the DNR going to have to go back and revisit that master plan? That's a couple-year process right there.
The Army doesn't actually have, they have covenants within the transfer documents that allow them to remediate if necessary.
This is,
So there are differences.
you're talking a very intense array of wells here.
Oh, yes.
So the impact on the ground is going to be significant. It's going to change the nature of the Sauk-Prairie recreation area in some of those areas. It's going to change, for Dennis, some of those field areas are going to be out of production. So because these are federal tax dollars going into this, i.e. federal resources, we're looking at another NEPA document to analyze those impacts. So before you can spend the federal dollars, you gotta be able to document and publicly disclose for the decision maker those impacts. So when you build all that in, I assume you've done this in other areas. Why can't you give us some kind of a gross sense of what Bill's talking about?
So some of these sites that I mentioned, they are still injecting, and they started 10 years ago. They're re-injecting, and they're finding that maybe their contamination was too high in the beginning, or they were doing a much smaller injection. They were doing walls or tighter spacing. I don't know. So that's probably very different because it's much more cost prohibitive initially to just come up with that many millions of dollars up front. So there's a lot of people that are returning product again and again every so years, and they're sort of cycling through a different area. So they're doing a part of an area and then they're going to a different part of a plume several years later instead of trying to do it all within a couple years. So the original estimation was if the Army was going to spend as most money as they could within a few years, this is what they could accomplish, maximum proficiency. So that may not be realistic in the real world.
I don't want people to leave here tonight and think, well, okay, the Army's going to take alternative 4, fine, in a few years, it's all going to be cleaned up.
No.
We're talking still probably a couple of decades, very likely 20 years.
We'll know more once the remedial design phase is done. I think that will be the key.
The point is, there's a lot of variables here.
Oh, yes.
There's more unknowns than there are knowns.
There has to be contractors willing to perform the work, vendors that are going to be able to supply all the right products at the right time. This is very important to a part of it.
And there has to be some availability as well.
I mean, so Dennis is concerned with the land. We think about this constantly because we have a lot of monitoring wells already, already on USDA property. And so heavy consideration has to be thought about of when you do it, how you impact crop rate growth, where you can be to limit disturbances. There's definitely something that has to be thought of immediately with anything to do with their property. And they do stuff
Year-round either, you're saying during the temperature zones, when it's warm enough to use the wells, you're not talking for 12 months of a year.
There are times where you can. It depends on, you have to make sure the temperature is right for the product, but there are other ways to get around it, but you probably wouldn't want to do it when it was 0. So there might be some limitations because it's going to be less pumpable material. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of factors with our situation than maybe other sites that have. Texas doesn't have any issue usually with some of these sites I'm mentioning with the weather patterns being that cold.
What is the impact on vegetation in those other areas on top of them after all this has been done?
Well, it would just be the equipment that's going in and out. The injection will be taking place down to the 100 and some.
Stuff on top of the ground that has to, I mean, even just driving the equipment across the ground, that's huge.
With respect to the vegetable oil itself, do the anaerobic bacteria use that as a substrate that they live on and it ultimately eats that up, or is it?
Yeah, it'll eat.
Residual is what I'm asking.
No, there should not. It only lasts for maybe 2 years, and then you're going to consume everything within that zone. Some places have found less, some have had more than 2 years of availability, but that's a good thing, range to think about before it'll consume all of that. It's a carbon substrate that it uses. But it's going to take time within that anaerobic reaction for it to rebound to maybe the aerobic environment that it was used to. So it is going to take some, you're going to be monitoring it to make sure what is going to be now where groundwater switches back and recovers back to aerobic.
Did I miss this in the plan when I read it? Is there some, at least subjective comparative analysis in the plan that gives a taxpayer a reasonable assurance that this will be successful?
Subjective. I guess I'm not sure how.
I'm not looking for an objective one like a bench test would give you, but we've got a lot of core samples and so forth of what's down there in these formations, and we have a pretty good idea of what the lithology is there. You know what it was at Cornhusker and other areas. Is there any comparative analysis that was done that I missed?
Oh, it wasn't in the
Give us an
report.
idea of the
Yeah, what you're talking about wasn't in the proposed plan. No, there wasn't documentation of other sites or that kind of feedback specifically about the soil type or anything. There was no written part of that. So you didn't miss it, if that's what you're looking for. Yeah, so we've talked to vendors that are injecting the product. The vendor that I've talked to has supplied product to all 3 of these explosive sites in the past. And so they also evaluate what kind of vegetable oil, what's the makeup that works better with your soil type, and looks at all of your groundwater characteristics to see what kind of product mixture, because they have many different types of blends that work in different environments. So definitely something that is more thought about once you actually go ahead.
There are a number of statements in the plan that say that it will degrade. It will take care of VOCs and so forth. But there's no analysis to support that. So is the vendors and so forth that you've talked to, is the lithology that we've got in this formation at 100, 150 feet, is it within the range of the lithologies that they've already worked with and have been successful?
Yeah. So when I talked to him about, the sand that we've had, he recommended different kind of products that they've had success with, either be at the chlorinated solvent sites, and looking at your porosity, how fast does the water move. It was very important to him, tried to figure out what product would last the longest, thinking about how fast our groundwater moves. And they've had other sites that move much faster than ours. And so they were looking at what type of oil product blend would be best for that kind of situation. So they've seen a lot of different types of sites. And this is just the one vendor. One vendor that I talked to again recently. There are numerous vendors out there that are doing vegetable oil type products. We probably have to move on soon.
Can I get a show of hands? How many people plan on providing an oral comment tonight?
We just want to make sure we have plenty of
I just want to
time
make sure
in
there's
case.
time for comments if we need to provide them. How about online?
There is one online. Laura did have another question at present.
Okay, so we can probably,
So for oral comments, we don't have anyone here currently? Is that right? Oh, okay. Oh, sorry, we were just, so there are, okay.
so we have 4 oral comments then?
Okay.
No, I was told I could submit my comment now, that I would wait till now, and I'm here. This is Laura.
Okay, so oral comments will start after the RAB meeting is completed.
And if you cannot hear me, then...
Oh, I can hear you, but Laura, we just have to wait for your official comment until we end the RAB meeting.
And just a reminder for everyone, if you're going to submit an oral comment, there's no reason to submit that same comment in writing. If you're going to submit a written comment, there's no reason to submit that written comment orally. The comments will be responded to as one comment, no matter how many times we hear it from you, whether it's in email, in
At the
the...
top of the meeting. I asked Army at the top of the meeting, and they said that I should hang on, which I have done. And I was asked to submit it in writing, which I did, and I want to read it into the record.
Okay, you don't need to read it into the record if you submit it in writing. The record is...
I want to read it into the record. This is ridiculous now.
Okay.
The purpose of this meeting is for Badger RAB members to be able to speak. I'm just asking to have the floor for 3 minutes.
Oh, we need to finish.
I want to clarify that the Army sent a letter in November 2024, which clearly states while DNR utilizes a 10 to the -6 cancer risk threshold for all groundwater, the Army is not utilizing those requirements in determining risk, and therefore contaminants of concern for site-wide groundwater within the boundary of the former Badger Army ammunition plant. Since it's the only comment received from DNR on the proposed plan therefore will be considered final, and we will move to public comment. And I'm submitting and have asked that paper copies be handed out at the RAB meeting, that a resolution is being submitted and by certain members of the Badger Restoration Advisory Board. The title is Supporting U.S. Army Compliance with Wisconsin Groundwater Standards and DNR Directives added near the Badger Army Ammunition Plant. Whereas the U.S. Army Command has informed the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources that it will not comply with state enforceable groundwater standards for certain cancer-causing chemicals that have migrated to groundwater. And whereas for decades, contamination from the former 7,400-acre Badger Army Ammunition Plant has been moving off-site and now poses a threat to as many as 300 residential drinking water wells in rural Sauk County. And whereas the DNR has issued at least 3 formal letters in June 2023, in October 2023, and again in October 2024, to the U.S. Army calling for compliance with state groundwater standards. And whereas the Army is pursuing a level of cleanup that is 100 times less protective of human health, meaning 1 to 10 to the minus 4 for the Badger land. And whereas the purpose of the Badger RAB is to serve as an avenue for communications between the installation, state and federal officials, and the community about environmental restoration activities at the former Badger Army Ammunition Plant. Therefore, we, the undersigned members of the Badger Restoration Advisory Board, call on Wisconsin Governor Tony Evers to act to assure that the Department of Defense fully complies with state environmental rules and regulations and to act to protect the health and sustainability of Wisconsin's groundwater at Badger Army Ammunition Plant and throughout the state. It is signed by myself, Laura Ola, with Citizens for Safe Water Around Badger on the RAB. Charlie Wilhelm, at-large member, Kendall Lenz, at-large member, Bill Steeling, Sauk City, Mike Gleason, Lake Wisconsin Alliance, Doug Jerkson, Thomas Sumter, Chris Hansen, member at-large, Michelle Hopp, Village of Merrimack, and other RAB members are invited to add their name by contacting me by email or phone, and thank you for that. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions before we actually start the public comment period? In back first.
I said one that, I'm sorry, I haven't been to a meeting in a while, but we talked about dredging of Brewers Grove, and I don't even know what the issue was, and it was not brought up at all today. What is the issue with the Brewers Grove Bay, and you were going to do some dredging a while ago?
I know that there is going to be an update. Is it possibly the next meeting, Quan?
Yes, the next RAB meeting in April, we will go back to our agenda of including the River Grove update.
Okay, so this is just about the water stuff, and the next meeting will talk maybe about that Bay.
I think we might also be providing an update on the settling ponds.
Other issues?
Yeah, there's other projects. I mean, yeah, there's other projects.
The issue there is not one way.
Yeah, today we just want to focus on the proposal on the agenda.
Okay.
And we'll do it with questions.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Bill, did you have a follow-up question?
Simple question. Now, when you start treating with the wells, drilling the wells and starting the flow of your ingredient into the well, do you start at the end of the plume or the start of the plume? And realizing the plume may be moving, so if you start at the end of the plume, you'll have to go back to see where the end of the plume is.
My concept and what most people would consider is you want to start in more of the contaminated zone anyways, because you want to see what is the worst area that your treatment can affect and look at the most reduction that you can get. Plus your cost dollars are going to where it's the worst case scenario, but it's going to be further off site. So you're going to also you can evaluate that situation about any movement of that and how it would be affected. But I definitely would prefer that you stay as close to the source area in the highest zone first.
So you're not treating the whole plume. You're going to start with the worst contamination.
I guess it would depend on what kind of contractual document the Army can come up with for how much work can be done within a year or 2 years. What is the viability of doing all of that? And like the USDA is talking about with how that affects, the land, because there's going to be those considerations about, well, we're not going to allow you to do it in this time of year. Can you wait until this? And so now you're going to have to move your situation around. So we do that with sampling too, as we try to accommodate when crops are going in, we try to wait as much as we can. So I'm sure the same situation would be thought through while you're trying to do that. Anybody have any other questions on the presentation? And then once we end this, then there are no answers to anybody's comments, just so you're aware. If you want an answer, this is the time to do it.
I think it might be a silly question, I don't know. What about horizontal drilling? Has that been a consideration, or is that a possibility in this situation?
Yes. So we did consider horizontal quite a bit. We talked to some vendors specifically about like underneath the propellant burning ground itself that has a liner on top that we do not want to penetrate. It is very good at restricting the groundwater. But we were trying to evaluate what would happen if you tried to go down. You do have to go out very far to get to that 100 and some foot depth with a horizontal drilling machine. Your end pipe and outlet can go really far. So take for instance that we would have to be out in the farm field to the west, like that research area that you guys have. We'd have to be out there with the drilling machine or the exit piping, and then you would insert a pipe into the ground that then you could possibly then pump your chemical into. So we did look a lot of, the engineer and I did a lot of trying to figure that out. It was ultimately not kept in the design at the moment. But that's saying that that can't be rethought of, but it isn't in this particular thought process.
It seems to me that you could be more prescriptive about where you had that land impact by doing horizontal.
So you're thinking more about outside of like the capped area, how you would be able to do that?
Yeah, that perhaps it's, adjacent to, let's say, to the east of the propellant burning ground. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
In an area that's not farmland, it's not all that heavily used in terms of the recreational area, but yet you would still be able to access the site of interest.
Yeah, we do know that the cost can get pretty high for one horizontal boring. I don't recall what some of that was. I don't know if Brian here would even want to say, but him and I were working on that. But it is much more expensive than just some vertical holes. But you're looking at something that you almost have permanently in the ground if you're going to ever re-inject again, because it could be another couple $100,000. So it is a lot more work with the distance that they have to travel to go out to that horizontal.
Concentrated impact is the point I'm trying to make. That
right.
If you're going to mess with an area, have a sacrifice area, do the damage there rather than 7,000, not 7,000 acres, but 2,000 acres of that 7,000 maybe.
Yeah.
Impacted here.
I'd say we definitely want to keep you involved with whatever's going on and through the design to see what we can do.
Just by looking at where those drill points are going to be, just a rough estimate, is probably in the order of 500 of our 1,200 acres of farmland.
Yeah, there's a lot of that plume that is in that farmland up on the moraine.
And that's the kind of comments we want to have submitted, things we need to consider that you don't think we have.
Can you provide that in writing? Is that good? You're going to have a written comment? Okay, that's good. All right.
One more quick question. Does this decision and the plan, the preferred alternative, in at least the short term, change any of the well testing that you're going to be doing? Is it going to be consistent with what you're doing right now?
For the proposed plan, that has nothing to do with the current testing.
Is there any proposed changes to the current testing wells or not?
There is going to be some proposed changes. We are going to submit a report to the DNR this year about changing some of the monitoring. Mostly, it's going to be to provide a base document of what the monitoring plan will be going forward, that can be changed if needed be. So that the DNR had asked for that specifically.
So separate from this document here.
Correct.
You should pay attention because there could be some changes happening.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, we're definitely going to provide that at a future RAB meeting to people to what might be changing.
And if you're on our mailing list, you would get it by email. If you're not on the email list and you want to be, please give us your information back at the desk and we'll make sure you get that information by email too.
Okay.
Quick question. Are the current monitoring and testing costs, are those included in the numbers that are shown up in those alternatives?
Yeah, all the monitoring costs would be in those alternatives. Yeah, so we had to forecast out the monitoring program. So the best way is to use your existing and then evaluate it forward. Yep. Can we move to end
Are there any more
the presentation?
online?
No more questions online.
Okay, so just to make everyone aware, this concludes the RAB portion of the meeting. The public comment, oral comment portion of the will start in about 5 minutes. And that is where the Army is in a listening mode only. We will take people in order since there doesn't seem to be that many people. We'll take whoever's in the room who wants to comment, and then we'll take whoever's online. It doesn't appear that we need to limit the comments. We have until 8:30. If we get additions, then we may have to start limiting, but right now, it looks like we'll be fine. The reason we have to separate them is the oral comment and public comment period is required by law, and there has to be a complete transcript of everything said. And so that's why the RAB meeting is held like a RAB meeting. We answer all your questions, but when we do the oral comments, all we are doing is taking you stand up, you give your oral comment, and then we move on to the next person. There will be no response.
So I will apologize. I did have, there's supposed to be a court reporter kind of recording it all. Unfortunately, she had called early before this meeting and said that she was very sick. Otherwise, she'd be taking it right at the meeting. But she is we're going to work with Mark, and so she's going to be getting the transcript for all of the video or listening to everything so that she can get it down into the format that we need to have so that everything is placed. So we will also be reviewing in the Army to see if there's anything that is misconstrued that she doesn't pick up on when she actually gets the recording. And so the people that we hire are only people that would work at like Dane County Courthouse or litigation. So this is what they do for a living, is to come up with this. So just so you know that otherwise they would be here ready to go.
Sure. Well, let's go ahead and take 7 minutes and we'll start right at 8 o'clock. welcome to. Please remember, you can submit a written comment until the 28th of February. When we do the responsiveness summary, we respond to all the comments in one document. Any questions?
I know that if anyone was out there, I asked to know if you had a
Chris, did you want to go first?
Not really.
Well, if you don't, it's only you and Bill, as far as I know. Yes. No, we need you to go up to the podium so that we can get a good recording. Okay, if everybody could take a seat, we'll do our official oral comments on the proposed plan for the former Badger Army ammunition plant groundwater remediation. Please state your name and then give your comments.
Is this working? Yeah. Yep. Okay. Many of you know me. I'm Chris Hansen. I'm on the RAB here. Been on the RAB for about 14 years now. And as I understand it, some parts of this process of cleanup have been going on close to 30 years. I live in an area called the Coves Court area on the east side of the former Badger plant between Highway 78 and Lake Wisconsin. When I got on the RAB, I really had two objectives. One was to assure residents that I'm going to try to make sure that they have clean drinking water to drink at their homes. Secondly, I wanted to make sure that public dollars, our tax dollars, were being responsibly spent. Now there's two long-term or objectives here. There's a short-term objective of taking care of the people out here, in other words, the residents, and making sure that they have clean water to drink. There's also that long-term regulatory requirement, an objective that's the DNR enforces, it's delegated from EPA under CERCLA and so forth. And basically CERCLA is a law that says that if you messed it up, you get to clean it up. And when you look at responsible parties under CERCLA, in this case, we really have one party, and that's the Army. Well, CERCLA goes a little bit further, and it's a bit of a draconian law in that it not only looks for responsible parties, but responsible parties that have money and the capability to clean it up. So guess what? There's the Army. And who pays for that? The taxpayer. So hence the responsibility for the tax dollars. Now, specific to the proposed plan, there are several concerns that I have. One is the proposed plan does not provide the certainty of cleanup. It just gives us the best hope, and it gives us subjective reassurances that this alternative 4 will actually work. As I mentioned earlier, I would like to see at least a subjective comparative analysis of the experiences that the Army's had in other areas to give the taxpayer some reassurance that this, in fact, would be successful. Secondly, as we've talked about somewhat here, is there is no timeline in here for the cleanup. Given the Army's experience in other areas, I would hope that it could provide at least some basic thumbnail approach to how long it's going to take for the bench testing, the pilot study, and ultimately full implementation. As I mentioned earlier, I think we're probably looking at decades yet here for cleanup, which is, that's a reality. There are a lot of variables here that we still don't have answers to. With respect to the effectiveness here, I think we as the public need to ask ourselves, is there a risk analysis? They did a risk analysis for human health, and that's great. I'm glad that was done. And there are some issues with that, as I understand, but there's no risk analysis for the taxpayer. what we used to call benefit ratios. I don't see that. What is the assurance here again that the taxpayer is getting their money's worth here? Because of all the variables that I'm talking about here, I am going to recommend that the preferred alternative for the Army be changed to be a combination of alternative 4 and 5. For alternative 5, which is well replacement, the current criteria is that it has to be above the enforcement standard. I would recommend, and quite honestly, I bounced this off from a representative from the Pentagon in this building in 2017 when they were out here for a meeting where they reassured us that they were not going to go forward with a municipal well system and water system here. And he said that this approach might actually be doable, but then I never heard anything more from him. But what I'm talking about here is a modification of the criteria for well replacement to change it from where there's an exceedance of the enforcement standard to where there's an exceedance of the preventative action limit, and I want to emphasize that, and the modeling that the Army already does shows a reasonable chance that that well is going to continue to be contaminated. With respect to alternative 4, I have a concern about spending a heck of a lot of money here. The total cost of alternative 4 for all 3 plumes is in excess of $45 million. 23 of that is for the central plume. So what I am recommending is that once you get past the bench testing, once you get past the pilot and look into actually doing the full implementation, that you start with the propellant burning ground, the deterrent burning ground, but you defer implementation of the central plume for 2 reasons. One, it's the most expensive. And number 2, the land use pattern and land ownership pattern, the central plume, is, with the exception of the water's edge area, it's all publicly owned, either Dairy Forage, the state of Wisconsin, or some other public entity. And those public entities that receive that land have the land use controls on them. So the impact to the human environment, to the people and the residents, is relatively low there compared to the other areas. So I am recommending a combined alternative approach that modifies the well replacement criteria and defers the EVO implementation in the central plume. The benefits of this would be that anybody that's having their well replaced would have the certainty of the drinking water that is clean. It could potentially save the taxpayers in excess of $20 million. And quite honestly, the Army would be proactive in this situation, not just reactive, and maybe for once they'd get some good PR. And finally, you know, if this whole approach does not work, I don't want to be 20 years from now and looking back and still having to look some homeowners in the eye and say, we still haven't fixed the problem. We could replace every homeowner's residential well that's in the target of these plumes, according to my calculations, for less than $1 million. With respect to the criteria that I just laid out, those wells could be replaced for less than $300,000. Now that doesn't meet the CERCLA requirement to clean everything up, but from a taxpayer standpoint, you know, I think we could find some common ground here. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Bill? Would you like to give a comment? Please state your name first, and then go ahead with your comment.
William Staling, representing Sauk City. This project is going to take dollars and time. Where are we going to get the dollars, and how are we going to lobby for the dollars with U.S. government, Army, Pentagon, and the state of Wisconsin government? How can we lobby for those? We're going to have to answer that within our board. I don't know what help we can get from the Army in answering, but we have to get some facts and what they estimate the dollars will be. So we're going to have to lobby to get those dollars over the time that it's going to take to do this job and to see it in its end. So I hope we can gain information from the Army, from their project estimations of dollars and time, so we can go out and, as citizens of the state of Wisconsin, do something to get those dollars in a budget, because if it's not going to be budgeted, we're not going to get the money. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Is there anyone else in the room who wants to give a comment? Is there anyone online who wants to give a comment? All right, that concludes our oral comment period. Thank you all very much for coming, for taking time out of your busy schedule. Have a great night